7. Girl. Cage. Chimp. Picture, if you will, a 4-year-old girl in a cage. She has been captured, screaming. She saw her parents beaten off by the kidnappers. She rocks to and fro, showing obvious signs of fear and mental instability. It is unclear quite what is being done to her, but some of the time she undoubtedly suffers physical pain. Wires are attached to a shaven portion of her head and, although she is given food and water, it looks as if some drugs are mixed within. Perhaps I have asked you to picture a political torture camp. Maybe she has been placed under these stressful conditions to frighten her parents into confessing to political outrages. Perhaps I have asked you to picture a daughter who has been kidnapped and is being held to ransom. Or am I raising the question of whether picturing possesses moral dimensions? Not at all. For my purposes, you are picturing a child actress, playing the part of a caged girl in My Mate's a Primate, a short advertisement made by Animal Defenders International. Many people, if they encounter such films, dismiss the scenes as fantasies dreamt up by crazy animal liberationists. Some scientists, such as those engaged in testing on animals, stress the unfair emotional appeal. They speak of how well animals are cared for when undergoing experimentation, adding, in truth, that they are thereby safe from their usual predators. Many people are shocked by the images of caged and frightened animals undergoing all kinds of testing. Some conclude that animal experimentation should be banned. Others argue that such experimentation is nasty, but also necessary for the proper development of drugs to benefit mankind, and even animal kind. Our puzzle rests not on challenging the facts but on the consistency of those who argue in favor of animal testing. Assume that the favorers are right, that testing on live animals is needed for the development of safe drugs. Assume that the suffering caused by such testing is a necessary evil, far outweighed by the eventual benefits, for it would be irresponsible to distribute untested drugs to thousands of ill people. Note that such reasoning, in terms of overall consequences, is often deployed by people who are otherwise appalled at thinking about right and wrong in terms of consequences. Such people would usually speak of rights which should not be violated, however welcome the eventual consequences. Based on the assumptions just given, here comes the puzzle. There are early stages of human lives in which the human's emotional and intellectual awareness and their perspective on the world are less than those of, for example, adult chimps. Some claim that adult chimps possess the same mental and emotional development as 4-year-old children, hence the particular film mentioned above. Whatever the exact age, whatever the animal, the question is, why is animal experimentation morally permissible if experimentation on children is not? If the answer is simply that children are human, whereas chimps are not, the answer is are exposed to the charge of speciesism. They are discriminating between creatures purely on the basis of species membership, and that is akin to discriminating between people because of their race or sex. Such discrimination is unfair, unless some characteristics of that species, race or sex, can be shown to justify the difference in treatment. We are not being sexist in providing prostate cancer screening for men but not for women. Obviously, a relevant male-female difference justifies the different treatment. Arguably, we are not speciesist when we kill sheep painlessly while rejecting the killing of humans. In killing sheep, in contrast to adult humans, we are not destroying individuals who possess a sense of continuing into the future, with plans, hopes and intentions. We are speciesist if we inflict suffering on chimps but not on children, when we have no reason to think the suffering would be less for the chimps, and when we know that no other differences are relevant. Replies to this reasoning rely either on uncovering some morally relevant differences between the tested animals and humans or on justifying speciesism. The replies raise their own puzzles. There are, of course, differences. children have the potential for considerably more enriched lives than chimps, monkeys, and many other animals. That is no doubt true, but why should what is potentially the case carry such weight? Fertilized human eggs possess the potential to become people, yet we do not treat them as people, and many people find abortions morally acceptable. We should also wonder whether it is really potential that explains people's seemingly speciesist attitudes, and, if it does explain them, whether their grounds are good. After all, the child could be one with such brain damage that she lacks any potential for further development. Suppose a choice has to be made between saving a child and a non-human animal from temporary pain which would cause no adverse long-term consequences for either. Most people would insist that protecting the child is the right thing to do. Yet, if the suffering is the same, what can justify that discrimination? And if we think that it is simply wrong to inflict suffering on a child, independently of overall beneficial consequences, why is that stance not also applied to non-human animals? Should not the relevant moral question be Jeremy Bentham's, when applying his utilitarian concern for overall happiness, namely, can they suffer? That is, of course, a relevant question, but is it the only one? Let us take the rejection of sexism, racism, and speciesism further. One such suggested ISM is family ISM. Is family ISM also morally wrong? Is the preference that mothers have for their own children over others justified? How about friend ISM? Is a greater affection for our friends than for unknown people morally wrong? How about blonde ISM, good looks ISM, music lover ISM, nation ISM? These weird examples should remind us that we have numerous preferences, based on how we feel, and without them we should probably cease to be human. These examples should also remind us that we need to assess when preferences are justified and when they are not, if we are to have flourishing lives. A woman's preference for bearded men in her personal life should, it almost goes without saying, not be condemned. The author declares no interest here, but using that preference to judge, for example, which man told the truth in court merits obvious rejection. We are speciesist, and that in itself can paradoxically be used to show that we are not. Being speciesist, we feel far more distress at a child's suffering than a non-human animal's, so that itself generates a morally relevant difference in outcome, but one worthy of support. A 4-year-old child, chimp or rabbit also suffers from not knowing what is going on. From this we may conclude that there can be more reason not to conduct painful experiments on children, chimps or rabbits than on fully grown rational people. If the experiments are intended to benefit mankind, then at least the adults can grasp the value of that aim. Furthermore, performing tests on the young will, in all likelihood, damage their future adulthood or radically cut short their lives. That suggests that maybe we should turn from children to the elderly. If testing is necessary, may there not be some people, nearing death, prepared to sacrifice themselves for others? At least their sufferings would be mitigated by the knowledge that the sufferings were all in a good cause. In as far as we are repelled by such a suggestion and, in view of my age and the topic, I do now declare some interest, perhaps we should cease to shut our eyes to the misuse of animals in experimentation. We should also cease to keep our eyes firmly closed to the many other harms visited upon many creatures, courtesy of various forms of horrendous farming methods. That ought not, of course, to lead us to reduce our concern for the sufferings, distress and sorrows of millions of human beings. There is much to be done to relieve pains and hardships. That we cannot do all the much does not excuse doing nothing at all. 8. Lucky for some. My apologies for another puzzling tale of violence. The puzzle occurs with all manner of actions which are open to moral blame or praise and which reap society's punishments or rewards. The excesses of violence can, paradoxically, bring puzzles to life. We start with Jack and Jill. Jill took a liking to Jack's wealth and a disliking to Jack, so much so that she wanted to kill him, steal his money and escape to an Isle of Dreams. Jack was not keen on the idea and kept clear of Jill. Jill went hunting for her man. She found him at the top of a hill and tripped him up, knocking him unconscious, then drowned him in a bucket of water. It was horrendous behavior. She was a deliberate killer. She was convicted of murder. Had Jill failed to trip Jack or had the bucket been empty, then perhaps Jack would have survived. Jill would have been guilty of attempted murder, avoiding the longer sentence, or shorter, if a death sentence associated with murder. Yet this difference in treatment resulted from events outside her control. She was as morally defective in both cases, though maybe practically more inept in the second. We may, though, ask, as we did with Paul Barrington, Chapter 6, why the law metes out different punishments when the moral wickedness is the same. Whether people deserve moral praise or blame should not depend on accidents, luck or unluck, which are outside their control. The goodness, or otherwise, of our intentions is surely what matters morally. Suppose that when Jill met Jack at the hill's top, he happened to stumble, fell face down in the water and drowned, but Jill did nothing to save him. Is she not as morally culpable as in the first tale, when she drowned him? That raises a further puzzle of what morally relevant difference there is, if any, between killing and letting die, between the active and the passive. Distinctions, it is claimed, that are relevant to the medical treatment of the terminally ill. Here are two further examples of moral muddles, when we seek to evaluate responsibilities, praise and blame. You are sometimes careless when you drive. You fiddle with your lipstick, mobile telephone or car radio. You might have taken the odd drink too many. Few people treat you as being significantly morally blameworthy. Yet if children run into the road and your reactions are slow and they are killed, are you not seriously blameworthy? In all likelihood you would blame yourself for what you did. Yet the difference in extent of moral blame hangs solely on the children's running out, an event utterly outside your control. Mr. Miller is a family man, living in Britain, who has a limited choice of jobs available to him: security guard or gas fitter. He is easy to get on with, a man loved by his family and friends. Consider a similar family man with similar characteristics, Herr Müller. He lived in Nazi Germany and the only jobs available to him were working as camp guard or gas fitter in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Through his job, he ended up at that camp being involved in the killing of hundreds of thousands of innocent Poles, Russians and even more Jews. What a morally disreputable person. How could anyone have anything at all to do with such horrendous evils? Yet is it not circumstances outside the control of both Miller and Müller, that determine which of these two is deemed morally nice and which morally nasty? Many of us are incredibly lucky not to have been placed in circumstances where, in all likelihood, we should find ourselves acting similarly to Herr Müller. Should we be morally praised or blamed only for things within our control? Immanuel Kant answered, yes. Writing over 200 years ago, he insisted that a good will should shine like a jewel, independently of what it accomplishes or fails to accomplish. A bad will, we may add, is like a black hole of evil, whether or not it draws in others. Even if Jill fails to kill Jack, her will or intent marks her as morally disreputable. Even if no child gets injured, we remain morally reprehensible if we drive carelessly. Although Miller has a peaceful, gentle life, if his character is such that, in awful circumstances, he would allow himself to be involved in horrendous killings, then maybe he is as bad as Müller. The puzzle is that, if we shield moral assessment from anything to do with what lies outside our control, we are in danger of losing morality completely. We spoke of Miller and Müller's characters. Did they have any control over what characters they would have, whether they would be courageous or weak-willed, principled or fickle, good at assessing moral responsibilities or not? Consider Jasmine, a highly impressionable young woman who is swept along by what her family and close friends do. Consider how Jasmine's choices and actions depend, in part, on her surrounding culture. In a Western, liberally educated setting, in a family and surroundings of non-believers, she is pretty likely to be tolerant, easygoing, valuing individuality and the democratic vote. Bring her up, though, reciting the Quran every day, being told by certain teachers that she must sacrifice her life to further Muhammad's word, and she may become highly intolerant, even turning to terrorism. Of course, we hasten to note, non-religious movements as well as Christian, Islamic and other faiths, have led to vast numbers of people being harmed or killed. The point here is not to engage in the debate of when, if ever, such killings are justified. It is not to try to assess whether the religious have done more harm than the non-religious. The point is that, if our moral worth must not depend on accidents outside our control, there seems to be nothing left of us that merits moral evaluation. In practice, we muddle through, sometimes allowing outside factors to excuse us for what we do and sometimes not. But should we? Some try to escape the muddle by examining what should be deemed to be within our control. Individuals are told to pull themselves together and be brave. If they fail, they reap the moral condemnation of being cowardly. Whether they can pull themselves together, though, would seem to depend on characteristics over which, ultimately, they are powerless. It may also depend on the luck of having people around them, telling them to pull themselves together, or coaxing them, encouraging them. In the legal world, we also muddle through. The sentences meted out to criminals can be reduced, or even quashed, if the defense lawyers manage successfully to argue that the criminal was mentally disturbed and that his actions were not really under his command, and so not really his actions at all. Yet being mentally undisturbed does not count as a mitigating factor. A thief argued that he was terribly sorry but he could not help what he did, given his bad upbringing, hence, he should not be held responsible for his thievery. The judge replied that she too was terribly sorry but, given her own upbringing, she could not help but give him a long sentence.